Have you ever seen a child who doesn't speak, who doesn't smile, and yet with just one press of a piano key, suddenly, the whole world goes quiet, just to listen? Today's story begins with a single note. But more than that, it begins with a moment. A moment when music didn't just make sound. It opened a door, for two hearts that didn't know they were waiting to be healed. If you believe music isn't about playing perfectly, but about daring to reach out and let someone else touch a single key, then this story is for you. Because today, you're about to witness something small, and yet life-changing. A silent boy, a street pianist, and a moment that spoke louder than any words ever could. Stay with us, because sometimes, all it takes is one note, to open a heart that's been closed for years. The streets of San Francisco were humming quietly that Saturday morning. The mist still clung to the tops of buildings, rolling down toward the sidewalks like a curtain being drawn on the day. Among the early risers were David Langley and his 8-year-old son Leo, walking side by side without holding hands. David, 58, wore his usual crisp charcoal coat and a quiet look of focus. To most of the world, he was known as a billionaire tech magnate, the founder of Langley Innovations, a man whose fortune had built smart cities and funded global research. But this morning, he wasn't a visionary. He was just a father, navigating the delicate silence of a boy who hadn't spoken a word in years. Leo walked with small, careful steps, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his navy blue sweater. His light brown hair curled slightly over his ears, and his gaze drifted, not outward but inward, somewhere unreachable. Leo had been diagnosed with nonverbal autism at age 3. Since then, David had learned to speak in subtler languages, routines, soft glances, the absence of sudden movements. He learned that touch could overwhelm his son. That crowded spaces were storms. That sometimes, silence was Leo's way of surviving. They were heading to a weekend exhibit at a local gallery, a small curated showing of abstract light installations. David had read that some children on the spectrum responded well to light and shadow, and he had quietly hoped for a flicker of engagement from Leo. Just a flicker. Anything. But as they turned onto a plaza framed by iron benches and sycamore trees, a sound stopped them both in their tracks. Music. Not from a speaker, not from a phone. It was live, soft, human, and utterly out of place amid the static buzz of the city. The source was a weathered upright piano placed beneath a lamppost. It had a worn oak frame and was slightly out of tune, but it sang nonetheless. David followed the sound and spotted her. A young woman, probably in her early 30s, sat at the piano with her eyes half closed. Her fingers moved slowly but deliberately over the keys, playing What a Wonderful World. She had auburn hair tied loosely at the back of her neck, and though she wore a simple long coat and boots, something about her presence felt grounded, like she wasn't performing for anyone, just breathing through the music. Pedestrians slowed as they passed, some lingering, some nodding with quiet appreciation. But David barely noticed them. He was watching Leo. His son had stopped walking. He was standing completely still, his head slightly tilted toward the sound. His eyes, usually darting or downcast, were fixed ahead. David didn't speak. He didn't move. Any sudden action might break the spell. He watched as Leo took one step. Then another. His small feet moved off the main path and onto the stone tiles of the plaza, toward the piano. David's breath caught. Leo wasn't reaching out, and he wasn't smiling. But he was listening, with his entire body. David could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed slightly, in the stillness of his fingers. He was absorbing the moment. The pianist continued to play, her touch gentle, almost reverent. It was as if she sensed something had shifted in her quiet audience, and she was choosing not to push it. David glanced around. A few others had noticed Leo, but no one interrupted. The world had slowed down, and for once, it wasn't because of David Langley's name or reputation. It was because something honest was happening. Something rare. The gallery could wait. David stepped back, allowing space between himself and Leo. His son hadn't looked at him once, but David felt more connected to him in that silence than he had in weeks. He sat on a bench nearby and watched. Not the pianist. Not the people. Just Leo, standing before a piano that didn't belong to them, listening to a woman who didn't know his name, in a city that rarely made room for stillness. In that moment, David realized something. Sometimes, the most powerful connections don't come from inventions, or investments, or carefully crafted interventions. They come from accidents, beautiful, fleeting accidents like a forgotten piano in a public square, and a child who decided to stop and listen. Sofia Rivera had been playing on that same corner every Saturday for almost a year. Not because she had to, but because her body needed to. Her mind, her heart, they needed to breathe, and this was how she did it. At 31, she had long since let go of the dream she once clutched so tightly at the conservatory. A car accident 2 years ago had fractured her right wrist and taken away the precision she once relied on. The surgeons did what they could, but some things never come back the same. She could still play, yes, but not with the fluid brilliance she once had. Not with the sharp, exacting control that earned her a seat at Carnegie's masterclass editions. The music world had no place for almost. So Sofia made a new place for herself. Out here, between a lamppost and a scuffed wooden bench, she wasn't judged by tempo or technique. She wasn't on stage. She was on the street, and here, her brokenness didn't matter. Out here, music was a form of exhale. A quiet rebellion. A soft reminder that beauty didn't have to be perfect to be felt. That morning, she sat on the piano bench wrapped in her long gray coat, fingers gently coaxing out the opening notes of What a Wonderful World. The air was brisk but not cruel. A few early passers-by dropped coins into the open case nearby. Sofia didn't watch them. She never played for the crowd. Her eyes stayed on her hands, her left still steady, her right a little slower, but graceful in its own rhythm. She wasn't trying to perform. She was just trying to breathe. That's when she felt it, not a sound, but a shift. There was a stillness behind her, just outside her periphery. Not the casual pause of a tourist or the idle curiosity of someone killing time. This was different. Intentional. Present. She glanced up, and saw him. A boy, maybe 8 years old, stood just beyond the edge of the piano. His eyes were locked on her fingers, wide and unblinking. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. Just stood there, staring like the music had tethered him to the ground. Sofia's hand slowed, but she didn't stop. She didn't want to startle him. She let the melody stretch longer between each phrase, softening the edges. Her gaze flicked briefly to the man nearby, tall in his 50s, watching the boy with a kind of focused stillness that said, "This is rare." Sofia returned her attention to the child. He hadn't spoken. His hands were clenched inside the sleeves of his sweater. But his body leaned, just slightly, toward the piano, like the music had taken root in his ribs and was pulling him forward. The moment hung there, delicate, almost sacred. Sofia played one more phrase and gently lifted her fingers. She didn't say anything at first. Didn't want to rupture the connection. But then, in the softest tone she could find, she offered a thread. "You wanna try?" The boy didn't respond, not with words. But his eyes flicked to her face, then to the keys. Sofia, without expectation, pointed to a single white key in the center of the board. "Just one," she said. "It's okay." She leaned slightly back on the bench, giving space, not pressure. The boy took a step. And then another. Every motion was cautious, measured like he was stepping onto a frozen lake. But he kept moving, drawn not by obligation, but by invitation. When he reached the piano, his small hand rose hesitantly. He hovered over the key Sofia had pointed to. Then, he pressed. A single note rang out, pure, simple, and resonant. The sound wasn't remarkable. It wasn't perfect. But in that moment, it was everything. The boy didn't smile, not fully, but something flickered across his face. Something close. A loosening. A shift. And Sophia, she exhaled. She didn't speak. Didn't touch the keys again. She just let the silence stretch around the note he had chosen, like the world was adjusting itself to make room for it. The man nearby, his father probably, was no longer watching her. His eyes were fixed on his son, and his mouth was open just slightly. Like he, too, was hearing something for the first time. Sophia sat still, her hands resting on her lap, the unfinished song hanging in the air like an unanswered question. But to her, it felt complete. David had been watching the moment unfold like someone watching glass fall in slow motion, beautiful but terrifying. Every instinct in him screamed to intervene. Leo didn't do well with sound. Not unpredictable sound, not the kind you couldn't control. Public spaces were always a calculated risk, sudden honks, raised voices, footsteps that echoed wrong. Even soft melodies could shatter his balance if they came at the wrong moment, from the wrong source. So when Leo stopped walking and turned toward the piano, David's hand instinctively reached out, ready to guide him away. "Leo, let's keep moving," he said quietly. But Leo didn't respond. He didn't turn. He didn't flinch. Instead, he remained motionless, eyes fixed on the pianist's hands, as if the rest of the world had faded to nothing. David took a breath, his hand still outstretched, and waited. It wasn't that he feared a meltdown, he knew those well, but more that he feared disappointing Leo, disrupting something his son had found on his own, something rare. And yet, he wasn't sure what to do. What was the right move when silence gave way to stillness, and stillness to possibility? The woman at the piano, Sophia, had stopped playing now. She looked up at Leo and smiled gently, not with the enthusiasm people often forced on children, but with a kind of softness that didn't demand anything in return. She didn't rush. She didn't speak right away. She simply nodded toward him, slowly, and then pointed to one of the middle white keys. "You want to try?" she asked, her voice low, steady. David held his breath. For a moment, Leo didn't move. His arms were still tucked into his sleeves, his body quiet but alert. Then, one foot moved forward. Just one. But to David, it was as if the earth had tilted. Leo was moving toward someone. Toward something. Of his own choosing. He took another step, then another. Small, hesitant steps like an animal approaching an unfamiliar hand. His gaze never left the piano. David could see how his son's breathing had changed, not shallow with anxiety, not held in fear, but open. Rhythmic. Sophia didn't shift, didn't blink too much. She simply let the space between them remain still and inviting. When Leo reached the piano, he stopped just short of touching it. He stood close enough to feel its presence, close enough to smell the worn wood and dust of the old instrument, but not yet ready to act. Sophia turned slightly to the side, her posture relaxed, as if to show she wasn't guarding the keys, wasn't claiming ownership. David watched as Leo slowly lifted his hand. It hovered in the air for a second, then another, as if weighing everything he had ever felt about noise, sound, pressure, expectation. Then he pressed. Just one key. A clean, unremarkable middle C. The note rang out, quiet but clear, rising into the morning air like a whispered name. And then, Leo smiled. It wasn't big. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. A slow inward curve of the lips, barely there, unless you were David, who hadn't seen that expression on his son's face in months. Something inside him cracked. He didn't cry. Not yet. But the tightness in his chest changed shape, no longer the squeeze of anxiety, but something softer. He felt heat rise to his eyes, and he blinked hard to keep it contained. The world didn't applaud. No one cheered. But something had shifted irreversibly. Leo looked at Sophia. Then back at the key. He didn't press another. He didn't need to. That single note had been enough. Sophia didn't fill the silence with more music. She simply smiled back at him, her hands resting quietly in her lap. David knew that in that moment, no one could fully understand what had just happened unless they had lived his life, walked through the quiet, the disconnect, the unspoken longing to reach your child and never quite knowing how. But he didn't need anyone else to understand. He understood. And so did Leo. The single note Leo had pressed lingered in the air, like the last ripple of a stone dropped into a still pond. And for a long weightless second, nothing followed. No rush, no noise, just stillness. The kind of stillness people rarely notice unless they're inside it. Then softly, Sophia placed her fingers back on the keys. She didn't restart her song. She didn't pick up where she left off. Instead, she played one gentle note, just above the one Leo had pressed. Then another, lower. A slow pattern. She let Leo's note be the seed, and everything she played after it grew from there. Carefully. Quietly. It wasn't a melody anyone could name. It wasn't complex or impressive. But it was honest. Responsive. A conversation in sound. Leo didn't flinch. He didn't move away. He stood still, eyes watching the keys again. Something in his posture suggested he recognized what was happening, not logically, but intuitively. He had started something, and now it was continuing. Because of him. One by one, people passing through the plaza began to slow their pace. A man in a business suit, holding a cup of coffee, stopped mid-stride. Two teenagers pushing a bike came to a halt just off the curb. A mother with a stroller lingered a few feet away. No one said anything. No one needed to. They just listened. They weren't listening to a concert. They were witnessing a moment. And the silence around the music only made it more powerful. Sophia continued to play, minimal, sparse, letting space lie between each note. She wasn't leading. She was following Leo's rhythm, or perhaps honoring it. She never looked at the crowd. Never acknowledged the small audience gathering around her. Her attention remained on the piano, and on the boy who had pressed a single key and in doing so, cracked something open. David sat frozen on the bench, hands clasped between his knees. His eyes were wet, though he hadn't noticed. It had crept up on him, the emotion. The overwhelming weight of it. He had brought Leo here to see some curated light exhibit. A last-ditch effort to find something his son might respond to. Something safe. Something structured. But Leo had responded to this. To a broken-down piano in a public plaza. To a woman who played like breathing. To a moment no one could have planned. David looked at Leo again. His son was still watching Sophia's hands, still listening, still present. Not in distress. Not disconnected. Just there. And that was enough to undo him. He turned his face slightly to the side and wiped his cheek with the back of his hand, careful not to sniff or draw attention. This wasn't his moment. It was Leo's. But it shook him all the same. The crowd around them remained silent, even reverent. A few people exchanged quiet glances, perhaps wondering who the boy was. Some may have assumed he was Sophia's student, or relative, or simply a gifted child drawn to music. But David didn't care what they assumed. All that mattered was this: his son had initiated something. Not with words. Not with gestures. But with music. Or at least the beginning of it. And Sophia had answered. Together, they were building something fragile and unrepeatable, note by note, breath by breath. She never overstepped. She never corrected him. She didn't turn this into a teaching moment or a performance. She simply played, with him, not for him. A duet made of pauses and restraint. Of tenderness. Of listening. The moment didn't last long in real time, perhaps 3 minutes. But for David, it felt suspended in a kind of timeless weightlessness. A memory forming as it was lived. When Sophia finally let her hands fall to her sides, she didn't say a word. She didn't bow or thank the onlookers. She simply looked at Leo, and nodded as if to say, "You did that." And Leo, he blinked slowly, his mouth almost forming a shape. Not a smile this time. Something quieter. Like acknowledgement. Like understanding. And for David, that was more than enough. The moment had passed, but it lingered in the air like the tail end of a song that didn't quite want to end. Sophia sat still for a few more seconds, letting her hands rest gently in her lap. The small gathering of onlookers slowly began to disperse, their footsteps respectful, voices kept low, as if they understood something sacred had just happened. No one clapped. No one asked for more. It wasn't that kind of performance. It wasn't a performance at all. Sophia finally stood, flexing her right wrist slightly. It still ached sometimes, especially after longer sessions, but today the ache felt different. Not heavy. Just present, like an old scar that no longer needed hiding. Leo had stepped back by then, returning to his father's side, quiet once more. But something in his face looked lighter. Not louder. Not open in any dramatic way. Just less closed. And that, Sophia knew, could be everything. She glanced once toward David, offering him a small nod. He returned it, eyes still glassy with the emotion he hadn't fully wiped away. Then he took his son's hand, not to pull him away, but to anchor him gently. Sophia turned back to the piano, gathering her things. A cloth bag with worn sheet music she rarely used anymore, a thermos of lukewarm coffee, a small box of dollar bills and coins. As she closed the fallboard over the keys, her hand froze. There, placed neatly on top of the piano's wood, was a business card. She hadn't seen anyone approach. No one had tapped her shoulder or handed it to her. It must have been left during those last few minutes, quiet as everything else. Curious, she picked it up. It was heavy stock, matte black, simple font. Elegant in a restrained kind of way. David Langley. Langley Innovations. Langley Foundation for Neurodiverse Youth. Sophia blinked. She recognized the name, not because she followed tech news, but because Langley's foundation had been featured in a recent article about inclusive learning spaces. A friend had sent it to her, half-joking, saying, "This guy's doing what you care about. Too bad he's a billionaire." But it wasn't the front of the card that made her heart catch. It was the handwritten note on the back. Scrawled in precise but unmistakably human ink. "Let's talk. You gave my son something no one else has, a sound of his own." She stared at the words. Then read them again. Sophia wasn't used to praise. Not the kind that mattered. Most of the time, people dropped change in her piano case and said things like "beautiful playing" or "you've got soul." It was nice. It kept her going. But it wasn't personal. This was different. This came from someone who had watched, closely, and understood. A sound of his own. Sophia sat back down on the bench, the card still in her hand. She looked around the plaza, but David and Leo were already gone, blended back into the rhythm of the city like any other father and son. No special send-off. No long goodbye. Just this card. This note. This invitation. And the strange feeling blooming in her chest, half wonder, half disbelief, that maybe, just maybe, what she did out here on Saturdays mattered in ways she hadn't dared to imagine. She ran her thumb over the ink, feeling the grooves where the pen had pressed. It was real. All of it. And somewhere, she realized, something had begun. Sophia hadn't expected to hear from him again. Not really. People often left kind words, even heartfelt ones, and then disappeared back into the current of their busy lives. That's what she assumed would happen with the man in the gray coat and the quiet boy who had pressed a single key. But 2 days later, an email arrived. It was short, courteous, and to the point. The subject line read, "Let's continue the conversation." David Langley invited her to meet him at the downtown offices of the Langley Foundation for Neurodiverse Youth. The tone of the message was direct, but warm. "There's something I'd like to propose," he wrote. "Your music reached my son. I'd like to talk about how it might reach others." Sophia reread the email 5 times before replying. Now, sitting across from him in a sleek conference room lined with large windows and even larger abstract paintings, she felt wildly out of place. Her fingers, usually so confident on piano keys, tugged nervously at the sleeves of her cardigan. David, however, seemed relaxed. Not the stiff, corporate type she had imagined. He wore a simple blue shirt, no tie, and his sleeves were rolled halfway up his forearms. On the table between them sat a folder labeled "One Key at a Time, Pilot Program." He tapped it gently. "This is what I'd like you to lead." Sophia blinked. "Me?" David nodded. "You." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for whatever that is." He offered a small, amused smile. "It's not about degrees or awards. It's about what I saw." She didn't say anything, so he continued. "You gave my son a moment of peace and connection that no therapist, no specialist, no device has ever given him. And you did it without speaking a word. Without forcing him to perform." David slid the folder closer to her. "We've been working on this idea for months. Mobile music stations. Real pianos, placed temporarily in schools, libraries, community centers that serve neurodivergent kids. Not to teach them how to play, but to invite them to touch, to listen, to explore. Freely. Without expectation." Sophia opened the folder. Inside were sketches, budget outlines, maps, and a simple mission statement. Every child deserves a key that opens their own sound. She felt a weight settle in her chest. It was the kind of feeling she only got when a song started writing itself in her mind. Quiet, insistent, full of something just beyond words. David watched her carefully. "We need someone who understands how to play imperfectly. Someone who knows how to make space instead of noise." Sophia looked up, hesitant. "But I only play half as well now." He didn't hesitate. "That half," he said softly, "reached all of him. That's more than most full concerts ever do." The room was silent again. Not heavy, just full. Sophia closed the folder slowly. She thought of Leo's small fingers pressing a single key. Of how her own hands had followed, unsure but open. She thought of the people who stopped, not for her, but for the quiet that happened after. And now this man, this father, was offering her a way to turn that moment into something more. Not a job. Not a comeback. But a mission. She looked at David. "What exactly would you need me to do?" He smiled. "Be who you already are. Bring that piano heart of yours into spaces where kids have never been invited to make sound before. Help them press one key. That's all." Sophia took a breath. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was rebuilding a broken career. She felt like she was beginning something entirely new. 3 weeks later, the room smelled faintly of polished wood and lemon cleaner. It wasn't a concert hall. It wasn't even a music room. It was just a small multipurpose room in a community center, fluorescent lights overhead, folding chairs pushed against the walls, and a dusty upright piano rolled in from storage. But it was enough. Sophia sat at the piano, her palms resting lightly on the keys, not playing yet, just feeling. Before her sat 6 children, aged anywhere from 6 to 10. Most sat in silence, their postures uncertain, glancing sideways, unsure of what this was or what they were expected to do. She didn't blame them. She wasn't here to teach them how to play. She was here to let them touch sound. One key at a time. Among the children was Leo. He sat near the end of the row, slightly turned away from the others, knees pulled in tight. But his eyes were on her. Watching. Listening, in his own way. Sophia smiled. She began to play. The melody she chose was slow and open, like a question with no rush for an answer. It was something she'd composed the night before, sitting on her apartment floor with the window cracked just enough to let in the wind. Her right hand still ached if she played too long. But she didn't need long today. Just enough to offer an invitation. Note by note, she built a space that didn't ask anything of the children in return. She didn't look at them directly. She let the music do the talking. Then gently, she lifted her hands from the keys. The room went quiet again. Sophia turned her head just slightly and looked toward Leo. He didn't move at first. But then, slowly, he stood. His sneakers made a soft scuff against the tile floor as he stepped forward. No one else in the room said a word. The other children watched, still as shadows. Leo approached the piano with a kind of cautious confidence. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just present. Sophia shifted to the side, giving him room. He reached out and pressed a key. A single tone rang out. Clear. Intentional. Then, after a pause, he pressed another. Not random. Not frantic. He was choosing. Sophia didn't move. Didn't resume playing. She simply turned her head toward him, meeting his eyes. And then, Leo did something he had never done before. He nodded. Just once. But in that single, quiet motion was 1,000 conversations. Sophia smiled, warm and still. She didn't clap. She didn't cheer. She just let the moment sit exactly as it was. Behind Leo, David stood near the doorway, watching. He had promised not to interfere. Not to speak unless invited. And when he saw that nod, small, almost imperceptible, he felt the tears rise before he could stop them. But he didn't wipe them away. Not this time. Because he wasn't hiding anymore. Neither was Leo. And in that quiet room, under buzzing fluorescent lights, with a piano slightly out of tune and a woman who played with half a hand, a boy who never spoke had said something louder than words. He was still here. And he was listening. There's a belief many of us carry without realizing it, that to make an impact, we need to be extraordinary. That to change someone's life, we must be brilliant, bold, fully equipped. We wait to be ready, to be whole, to be perfect. But sometimes, all it takes is one key. Not a song. Not a masterpiece. Just one note, offered with openness, without judgment. Sophia didn't play with full command anymore. Her right hand would never fully regain its strength. Her performances, by classical standards, would always be flawed. But none of that mattered to Leo. What she had given him that morning on the street wasn't technique. It was permission. Permission to press one key. Permission to make sound without being corrected. Permission to exist inside a moment of connection, on his terms. Leo didn't need a concert. He didn't need a curriculum. He needed a space where sound wasn't a demand, but an invitation. And Sophia gave him that, not because she had planned to, but because she was willing to pause and listen. She allowed herself to be incomplete, and in doing so, created space for him to begin. That's what music is, at its core. Not a performance. A conversation. And often, the most profound conversations begin with silence, and a single word spoken gently into it. In this case, that word was a note. One note. Pressed by a small boy who hadn't been able to say, "I'm here," in any other way. There are so many children like Leo. Children whose worlds exist in colors we don't see, whose thoughts move through tunnels we can't enter. Children who are waiting, not to be fixed, but to be invited. And there are so many adults like Sophia. People who have lost something, health, confidence, careers, and believe they no longer have anything valuable to offer. People who think that because they're not at their best, they have nothing to give. But sometimes, it is the half that remains that matters most. The cracked voice that still sings. The scarred hand that still reaches. The imperfect key that still plays. David had spent years searching for therapies, tools, strategies, anything that might help his son communicate. But in the end, what made the difference wasn't a professional solution. It was a quiet moment between two strangers, built not on instruction, but on invitation. That is the lesson. You don't have to play the whole song to change someone's life. You don't have to fix them. You don't even have to understand everything about them. You just have to show up and offer the key. And when they press it, when they take that first small step into sound, into connection, into presence, you stay. You listen. You don't rush to finish the song. You don't turn it into a lesson. You let it be what it is. Because sometimes, that one note, that's the sound of a heart beginning to open. That's the start of healing. That's everything. In the end, no one remembered what song she played that day. There was no recording, no applause, no standing ovation. Just a street corner, a worn piano, and a boy who didn't speak, pressing a single key like it was the only word he had in the world. And that was enough. Because she didn't set out to impress him. She didn't try to pull him into her world. She met him in his. No teaching. No correcting. No spotlight. Just space. The kind of space where a boy like Leo, so often misunderstood, overlooked or spoken over, could do something sacred, express. And that's what made all the difference. She didn't teach him music. She just gave him permission to be heard. If you've ever felt like you weren't enough to make a difference, like you weren't skilled enough, strong enough, or whole enough to change anything, remember this. Somewhere out there, someone is just waiting for one simple invitation. To press a single key. To be seen. To be heard. And you might be the one holding that key. If this story moved you, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone finally hear the sound of their own voice? We'd love to hear your story.